Hello everyone, this is Heath from Infinite Creativity and we are back with another video. Yes, I know, the trend for a slow upload rate continues and will continue so for the foreseeable future. But my finals are over and I have time to make a tutorial. We will start right after the intro. We will start with the procedural method. Here we can add simple shapes like a cylinder and a sphere. Then the magic happens in the shading tab. So let's go there. We will start by selecting our sphere and entering the local view by pressing the / key. Then we can add a gradient texture and add the texture coordinate and mapping node. We can do that by selecting the gradient texture and pressing Ctrl+T. This will only work if you have the Node Wrangler add-on enabled. Now we will press Ctrl Shift and then click on the gradient texture. This will give us a preview. Again, this will only work if you have the Node Wrangler add-on enabled. We will now understand how this process works before moving forward. Starting with what is a texture. A texture is a two-dimensional image wrapped around a 3D shape. You might have heard about nets. They are basically unwrapped versions of our 3D shapes. We'll keep this knowledge aside for now and texturing and UV unwrapping as a title for another video. For now, we will be using the gradient texture which is already built into Blender. You can see the preview of the gradient texture gives us a shade between black and white. Any shade between black and white represents a value between 1 and 0. For example, a grey shade would represent the value of 0.5. We can also change the position of the image texture by changing the values in the mapping node. You can do this by changing the location of the texture and the rotation of the texture on the X, Y and Z axis. We will understand this through a short representation.
If we consider this sphere and add our gradient texture, our sphere looks something like this. Now, you might say that this sphere doesn't resemble the sphere we have in Blender. For that, we will need a color ramp node. First, we will move the principled BSDF down and then add the color ramp node. Here, we will switch the interpolation from linear to constant. This will ensure that we don't get any values other than 0 and 1. We will also have to move this indicator to the center. You can do that by changing this value to 0.5. And you can see we have our desired sphere. Back here in our representation, the black part represents the value of 1 and the white part represents the value of 0. Let us see what happens if we rotate the texture up to 180 degrees. You can see that we get a motion like this. If we rotate the texture by 90 degrees, we can differentiate between the areas which represent the value of 1 and 0 respectively. Let us see how we can animate the rotation of our texture in Blender. Back here in Blender, you might think that changing the rotation values on the y-axis or any axis depending upon the rotation of your sphere might change the rotation of the texture. You are right, but it doesn't give you the desired result. For that, we'll have to make some adjustments. First of all, you'll have to link the object coordinates with the vector coordinates of the texture. Just follow the steps for now. We will get into the details of the texture coordinate node in yet another video. Now, if you observe, the location of our texture changes, and this is not what we want. You can revert back the location of our texture by changing this value and setting it to a really low number like 0.01. And we get our previous texture back. Now, if you change the value of rotation on the y-axis, you can see that we get our desired result. Now let us see how we can animate these values. Let us go to layout and switch to the rendered view. This will give us a view of our texture. Make sure you're using the Cycles render engine. You must make sure that your right side of the sphere is facing the top. For that, I will rotate my sphere by -90 degrees. Now let us animate the position of our texture. For that, expand this tab and switch to the shader editor. You can expand the shader editor like this. Now you have your values in the mapping node and the timeline. Make sure you're on the first frame and then hover over the y-axis rotation and press I. This will add a keyframe on the first frame. Now switch to the 10th frame of your timeline and then change this value to minus 180 degrees. And then press I again to add another keyframe. And you can see we get a desired result.
Now all we are left to do is to give it the look of an eye, pun intended.
Back in our representation, you would see that only if we could tell Blender that the black areas or all the values of 1 are opaque and the white areas or all the values of 0 are transparent, we would get the look of a robotic eye. Now, the next step might take some thinking, and so you may have to pause or rewind the video. We are going to mix the principled BSDF, which is opaque, with a glass BSDF, which is transparent. The factor which will determine the amount of mixing will be driven by our gradient texture. So, the black values would be a factor of 1, which would mean that the opaque principled BSDF would take over, while in the white regions, the factor would be 0 and the glass BSDF would take over. Back here in Blender, we can start by expanding the shader editor. Here we can add the mix shader node to mix the two shaders. We can also add a glass BSDF. Now you have to be careful to connect the principled BSDF to the top socket and the glass BSDF to the bottom socket. You can also disconnect the link between the gradient texture and the principled BSDF's base color. You can do that by pressing Ctrl, holding on right click and then dragging your mouse across. Then we'll use the output of color from the color ramp to drive the factor for the mix shader. Then we can take the output of the mix shader and put it into the surface input for the material output. Then we can switch to the rendered view and add a light source. For now, a sun will do. Now if you go to frame 1, you can see the difference between the material here and here. If you play the animation, you can see that the transparent parts rotate with the position of the texture. We are almost there. All we have to do is add our eyeball. But first, let's change the color of our eyelids to black. We can do that by changing the base color of the principled BSDF to black. I'll also decrease the roughness value and increase the metallic value all the way to 1. To make the eyeball, select your sphere, press Shift D to duplicate, press S to scale and type in 0.98 to make it a little smaller. Then select your eyelids and press H to hide it. Then select your eyeball, remove the material and add a new one. Then you can change the emission color to white and then increase the emission strength to something like 20. Now to add the black spot in between, you select the center vertex, press Ctrl number pad plus to expand your selection, or you can select these faces by shift clicking on them. Then go to this slot and add a new material. Click on assign to assign the material and make a new material. Change the base color to black. There you have the center spot in your eye. Now we'll see how to make this animation loop in Blender. We will start by unhiding our eyelids. We can do that by pressing Alt H and then you'll see this red line appear. Select your eyelids and go to the Material tab or the Shading tab. Then you can select the Mapping node to view the keyframes here. Then you can go to your timeline, press Shift D to duplicate the keyframes, press G and enter the number 20. You can do this how much ever times you want the animation to loop. For example, if I want this animation to loop thrice, you can press Shift T again and press G and then 20. You can see that the animation loops thrice. Now let's view an animation in which I made a robot with an eye animated in this way.
Thank you for watching.